Welcome to Chills with Chas. We'll continue the Haunted Heartland series with the stories A Temperate Ghost Story and The Old Slave House. Let's begin. The founder of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, Frances E. Willard, is remembered as an outspoken foe of alcohol and a champion of women's rights. Not at all the sort of person to believe in such things as ghosts, until her death in 1898. However, Miss Willard related the following eerie story to anyone who ever brought up the subject of hauntings. Belle Milner was a friend of the Willard family who had contracted a racking cough, possibly tuberculosis, in the mid-1880s. For nearly a year, she suffered in its debilitating effects before her doctor told her that she must move from smoggy Waukegan, Illinois, to the dreary, cleaner climate of American Southwest, or else face certain death. On a humid morning in the late summer of 1881, Belle Milner carefully packed her trunks in the bedroom of her family's modest home. She studied each artifact in the tidy room before she wrapped it and packed it away for the long train ride west. The hot sun filtered through the drawn drapes and fell across the hardwood floors. These curious specks called dust angels floated around the room as she emptied the closet. Belle was desperately weak. Any sustained effort made her cough, so that by mid-morning she was slumped in an armchair next to the bed. The street sounds seemed to recede as she closed her eyes, a slight rustling sound, and the momentary darkening of the sunlight seeped around the corners of the drapes made her sit up. Belle turned to face the window. The figure of Mary Willard, Frances Willard's sister, stared back. Mary was wearing a light salmon-colored dress. Her auburn hair, brushed low over her forehead, shimmered as sprays of sunlight fell across her face. She was as Belle had last seen her in 1862. She couldn't help but think that Mary looked as bright and as cheery as she had when the girls had last shared a schoolgirl confidence 2 decades before. Strangely, no words passed between the women. Belle was never sure how long Mary Willard had visited her, but she estimated it was at least 10 minutes. Belle sensed that Mary had stopped by to say farewell and comfort her friend. Belle knew that the Southwest held her only salvation, yet she was leaving her family and friends for what was then still referred to as the Wild West. Although nothing was spoken, Belle understood that Mary was trying to tell her, "Go ahead. Your health is all that matters. Don't think of the past. Look at the future." At length, the shady figure of Mary Willard faded away as if a light were being dimmed until it was extinguished. Belle later recalled. Belle Milner briefly related parts of the story to only a few close acquaintances, but not even Frances Willard could ever pry all the details from her. And no wonder. Mary Willard had died nearly 19 years before she visited Belle Milner, yet her message was for naught. The arid desert proved a tragically short respite for Belle, who died just 2 years after her move to Waukegan. Alright, now to the next story. The Old Slave House. David Rogers was grateful to have escaped the imposing Southern mansion that morning before Halloween in 1978. It had been a long night for the young man from Harrisburg. He had become the first person to successfully challenge the ghosts of black slaves that haunt the dismal attic of the old slave house built ironically near Equality, Illinois. While the consent of the house's owner, George M. Sist II, Rogers had entered the attic at 8 o'clock the previous evening. Although he had heard a lot of strange noises, Rogers did not encounter any of the spectral forms that had caused at least 150 previous ghost challengers to flee the former slave quarters on the mansion's 3rd floor. Rogers walked out of the house just after daybreak the following morning. David Rogers had heard the tales connected with the place about the rushing forms and horrific screams that had driven 2 tough Marine veterans from the house in 1966, of how the air chilled as a visitor moved up the narrow, steep staircase to the 3rd floor, and of how the wife of the owner saw vague forms disappear just before her range of view. But Rogers also saw a good story. He was a television reporter for WSIL-TV in Harrisburg. During an early program, he had challenged Sisk to allow him to spend the night in the attic. After some hesitation, Sisk agreed. Both men knew that no one except a slave had ever survived a night on that infamous 3rd floor where men, women, and children had been held in bondage by one of Illinois' most evil citizens. John Hart Crenshaw, who had built Hickory Hill, came from a fine old American family, but his sense of decency became perverted in his rush for wealth. His parents moved to Gallatin County after this home in New Madrid, Missouri, was destroyed in the Great Earthquake of 1811. The Crenshaws settled on Eagle Creek near one of the many salt deposits prevalent in the area near the Solon River. John's father, William, died when the boy was a teenager, leaving him to support his mother and 6 siblings. John went to work in the salt refinery. It was hard, back-breaking work that caused the young man to grow sullen and resentful. He had, however, no other option, not then. But sometime after John Crenshaw's marriage to Simeon Taylor in 1817, his life began to change. Because Illinois prohibited slavery and encouraged each man to gain an independent living, it became increasingly difficult to hire laborers, especially for the salt works. The government recognized this fact, permitted workers to lease slaves from owners in slave territory and bring them to Illinois to work. Crenshaw quickly saw his opportunity to become a wealthy man. He would become an employer. He leased several salt springs from the government and received permission to lease slaves from owners in Kentucky and Tennessee to work them. By 1834, John Crenshaw had amassed a fortune. He owned 3 furnaces used in reducing salt water to crystals, a mill on the North Fork of the Solon River, and nearly 30,000 acres of land. Now he could afford to give his wife the house of her dreams. Before the year was out, Crenshaw had begun construction of Hickory Hill. As the house took shape on a high, windswept hill near Equality, the owner's lust for money and power grew. When the house was completed 4 years later, in 1838, Crenshaw began kidnapping free black men and women. Some were destined to work for him in the salt works or in the fields. Others would be sold into slavery. Some historians say the house was carefully planned with this aim in mind. From the outside, it appeared to be of pseudo-Greek revival design, with the upper and lower verandas supported by massive columns extending the width of the house. Not rarely seen are the pillar innovations such as a carriageway that actually entered the house. Black men and women and children were said to have been brought into the house in a carriage and then hustled up the back staircase to be imprisoned in cold, dark attic cells, scarcely larger than horse stalls. This arrangement precluded curious neighbors and visitors from learning the true purpose of the house. Another legend maintains that a secret passageway once connected the house to a nearby creek. Slaves would be brought out the Ohio River by boat to the Solon River. They would be transferred to smaller craft on the Solon, moved upriver by night to a point near Hickory Hill, and then brought through the sacred passage in the house. But Crenshaw would not amiss slaves fast enough. He soon began a breeding program that provided him with additional slaves to sell on the southern market. A pregnant woman or one with a child brought several $100s more than a single slave. Uncle Bob, a giant of a black man, was chosen for his stamina and virility to sire the children. Confined as he was in a barren and unheated cell, only slightly larger than the tiny cell in which other slaves were kept, he served frightened young female slaves who were brought to him. He supposedly fathered 300 babies. The cells opened off both sides of the hallway, 12 feet wide and 50 feet long. Each cell had a narrow doorway and a window with bars across it. The window overlooked the hall, the only ventilation coming from the windows in the front and the rear gables of the house. Iron rings attached to the floor secured the imprisoned slaves. Today the rings are gone. The pieces of chains, shackles, and a whipping post remain to bear testimony to the cruelty inflicted upon helpless men and women in this attic torture chamber, where many were born and many died. In 1842, Crenshaw was accused of selling into slavery a family of free blacks who owned his services. He went to trial but was not convicted, possibly because of his financial and political eminence. but public sentiment was against him. His mill was burnt. John Hart Crenshaw died in 1871, and his wife, Sinan, 10 years later. They were buried in Hickory Hill Cemetery. Their deaths brought to an end a most shameful era in Illinois' history. Today, thousands of visitors tour Hickory Hill, which since Crenshaw's death is almost always called the Old Slave House. Owner George Sisk II and his wife Janice operate it as a museum and tourist attraction. It is also their home. The house has been in the Sisk family for nearly 80 years. George and his wife have restored the outside and the first and second floor as their living quarters. They did not go up to the attic, but visitors do. They see restraints of the hideous cells, various instruments of torture, and scarred marks on the wooden framework where cell doors once hung. One window remains barred. Some visitors return ashen-faced to report that they heard shuffling feet and whispers, crying. Most felt uneasy. They all want to know if Sisk believes that the house is haunted. Yes, he thinks it is. He claims that he does not believe in ghosts, but he respects them. In the late 1920s, the Benton, Illinois Post-Dispatch featured a story on the Old Slave House, written by exorcist named Hickman Whitington. Whitington was supposedly in splendid health when he visited the attic of the house. A few hours later, he was dead. George Sisk told psychic investigator Richard Weiner and Nancy Osborne Ishmael that he believed that Whiteman died of fright, that something in Hickory Hill scared him to death. What was it? Sisk doesn't know. Perhaps it was the same thing that terrified the two Marines 35 years earlier. They were sitting in the attic at 1 o'clock in the morning. Then suddenly the kerosene lantern, their only source of light, began to flicker. A terrible moan shook the walls. Voices came from everywhere. Human voices, speaking unintelligible words, swirling from bore down into the Marines. The light went out, and from the darkness came blood-curdling screams. In a panic they had never experienced in battle, the servicemen leaped down the stairs. Mrs. Sisk understands that panic. She did not stay alone in the house. She was afraid of the places in the early years of her marriage that temporarily left her husband, and she had to quit taking baths in the evening because of a voice yelling, "Janice!" She hurried from the bathroom, but no one was ever there. Miss Sisk still complains of the icy chill that pervades the rooms even on warm days, and she and her husband both feel they're being constantly observed. The house, from its hilltop position, is buffeted by winds. It is just the wind rattling the windows and whipping under the eaves that create the presence. Or do the voices of these doomed slaves still cry out in anguish? And why was David Rogers, the television reporter, the only one to withstand their lamentations? Alright, that is it for those stories. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.